Hey, I have started Little Big by John Crowley, a book that I bought the longest time ago, having heard it is that it was like a great classic in the world of fantasy, and have tried it a couple of times, tried to go into it a couple of times, and bounced off pretty quickly, um, because I think it is so odd and so strange, and yet also reminds me slightly of some of the contemporary books that I have listened to. Maybe I've done enough of them that it is I'm starting to be able to read it. Um, it's a 1981 book, I think it won the Fantasy Award for that year, the World Fantasy Award for that year. Um, it it starts in the 20th century, kind of modernish time, probably with the 1981 when it was published, of this guy called Bramble, who through a guy called George Mouse meets a cousin of his, um, uh, Alice Dale Drinkwater, who gets called Daily Alice, falls in love with her. She says, and it's like, okay, I'd like, and basically, it's like, I want to be with you and all that. And she's like, okay, but if you want to be with me, you have to do these things. And one of them is he has to walk all the way to her house from the city. Has to walk, can't get a ride or anything, can't buy food along the way. Has to has to like beg or ask for dinner somewhere, and he does all that, and he gets to the house, and the Drinkwater's house is a very bizarre house. It's like many houses. It's like it was a sampler house. It has like each side of it is a different kind of house, but it seems to be a little bit more than that, and it's got weird kind of geography to it. And we have a section where we go into a section where we hear about Alice's grandparents, John Drinkwater, who is an architect, and a fabulous architect, just like, amazing, bizarre things. I mean, he for a joke, when someone asked, he wanted to make basically a cathedral of finance, he made a skyscraper that was literally cathedral, with like, mocking kind of depictions of the person who was um, asking for it, the businessman who was asking for it, and just, fonts and all these sorts of things, and they actually accepted it. um, and he marries, and um, he meets Alice, who is English, and Alice Bramble, and her father is a theophist, theophist, basically about, like, kind of, and he goes to a lecture where he and his daughter are he's giving a lecture, but the main thing is his daughter, who apparently has seen into this world. And it's he has this whole theory of concentric circles, and within each circle, everything gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to the final one, and you're in fairyland, where it's just limitless vistas which you travel around. Um, and then it's like, okay, now hand it over to my daughter Alice, who's the actual one who's seen all this, but she doesn't want to do it, and John actually finds her kind of huddled up, and they make a connection, and they get married, and it turns out that she's pregnant already, but she won't say with who. And you wonder, it's like, oh, is this like a you start wondering if this is like something from the fairyland that has given the thing. Oh, and at a point, and I forgot, yeah, a thing, and they do get married, and they have children, and they have, and so, this is where it's like, is that Alice that they have? Because then that could make Alice half fairy, if that theory of mine is correct. Um, we also have Alice going back to talk to a fish in the water, grandfather fish in the water, who gives him who gave her the instructions on how um, Smokey was supposed to get there. Smokey, whose name is Smokey, because part of the reason his name is Smokey is that he's so anonymous, so kind of waferish. He himself was the wife, his mother married his father, but then found out he wasn't actually rich, and then left in a huff. And she was the striking one, and he was very kind of also very more anonymous and more kind of flipping off, and and he has a little bit of strikiness, but mostly he's smoky too. And he was raised by his father, kind of weird, odd, kind of piecemeal education of in the classics, and some of the kind of, but very isolated, very not, not never in school, so sort of innocent in that way, which is a part of what Alice likes about him. Um, it's a beautifully written book. Um, it is it is very fairyland-ish. Even the stuff that's in the 20th century feels like it's like out of time. At a certain point, he goes into the library to talk to the Drinkwater that is there now, the father, and there's George MacDonald books in the library, which is like George MacDonald is the original kind of Victorian, I think, Victorian or Edwardian, somewhere in there, guy who wrote that fantasy, which is where maybe a lot of one of the earlier examples of fantasy, even pre-Tolkien, of fantasy. So I think he's that kind of fantasy, the low fantasy, I guess is what they consider it. It's fantasy that's mixed with the real world. Also, if you when you want to gussy it up into literature, is magical realism, but no, it's just low fantasy versus high fantasy, which is separate fantasy, like separate world fantasy, not connected to this world at all, and is very kind of kings and queens and stuff, like where this is like regular folk with like interacting with magical beings within, intruding into our world, or sucking us out of our world and into the fairy world. So yeah, I've gotten 4 hours into it, 4 tracks into it, and it's going pretty good. Pretty good. It's definitely one of these things of, I think I'm benefiting listening to it in audiobook um, versus reading it. I think if I read it, I might drift off again. So it's good to have it in audiobook and listen to it this way, and then hopefully talk about it here. And starting to see the characters. I can see that this has been. I've some books. Aaron Morgenstern's book, I think, was a little bit too kind of like theater kids like this. Whereas Neil Gaiman's the House at the End of the Lane, I actually felt got a good kind of very grounded kind of version of this, where um, there were issues that the people were having that were recognizably human issues. This is probably a little bit more into the fairyland side of things, so it's a little harder to tack down to. I can see this is one of these books that you could read many, many times and get more and more out of it as you went along, which is sort of, that's a definition of classic. So that's where I am right now. I'll leave it there.